Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan. His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 12. Prime Minister Bhutto at the peak of his power, 1974. Bhutto was at his best in the times of crisis. Whether it was a superfluidity of adrenaline or his instinctive pugnacity in the face of any threat, especially physical, he always responded with heroic defiance. He seems so long to have anticipated early death that he appeared to show no fear when faced with its prospect, baring his chest rather than ducking, redoubling his speed in the race to achieve nuclear self sufficiency. Rather than agreeing to sign the No War Pact with India, once again offered to him, or the Nuclear Non Proliferation Treaty. He argued now that India had dynamited and shattered into pieces the Non Proliferation Treaty, and that a no war pact in the face of a nuclear threat would amount to capitulation. Mujib had flown to New Delhi to meet with Indira Gandhi while Zulfi was in Beijing. Despite seeming cordiality, no agreement was reached at this mini summit on the major issue of Bangladesh's strong objection to India's erection of a huge dam, Farakka Barrage, on the river Ganga near Calcutta, which could divert so much of Bangladesh's water as potentially to turn many lush districts into deserts. Bhutto had considered postponing his scheduled visit to Bangladesh in June, but when he read the reports of Indo-Bangladesh conflict over Farakka, decided it might be the ideal moment to fly into Dhaka with his entourage and seek to sweep Mujib back to a much closer relationship with himself and Pakistan. The visit proved a remarkable success, considering how recently he had been reviled as worse than Yahya by so many Bangladeshis. Let us forget the enmity and bitterness of the past and inaugurate a new chapter of hope and prosperity for our peoples, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman said, welcoming Bhutto to his first Dhaka banquet. We have come here with our gaze firmly fixed on the future, Zulfi warmly responded. The people of Pakistan cherish abiding goodwill and affection for the people of Bangladesh. They wish relations between Pakistan and Bangladesh. Mr. Prime Minister, this will be founded firmly on the principles of sovereign equality and mutual respect for each other's political independence and territorial integrity. He toasted Mujib's good health and long life, a life that would be brought to a bloody end on 15th August 1975. Even as Prime Minister Bhutto tried in Dhaka to recapture the friendship, if not allegiance, of some of the Bengali Muslim whose faith in Pakistan was violently shattered in 1971. Religious riots were rocking Punjab. The small cosmopolitan Qadian Ahmadi community, one of whose center was in Rabwa, Punjab, came into the most violent confrontation with neighboring Sunni fundamentalists since the 1953 to 1954 anti-Ahmadi riots launched by Maulana Maududi's followers in Lahore. Disciples of Qadian Ahmadi worshippers actually worshipped their prophet Mirza Ghulam Ahmad and were therefore considered heretics by Orthodox Sunnis. The high level of education that prevailed among Qadianis, however, helped them attain positions of disproportionate power and prominence in Pakistan's civil, military, and diplomatic services. Their wealth and power aroused the envy of poorer Pakistanis, and most fundamentalist mullahs and maulanas reviled them as non Muslims or traitors to Islamic law. When Bhutto returned from Bangladesh and found the Punjab in so volatile a state, he moved swiftly to defuse the problem. He appealed directly over the radio and television for immediate restoration of order in and around Rabwa, alerting the army and announcing his appointment of Justice Samdani of Lahore's High Court to serve as a one-man committee of inquiry into the Rabwa incident. The vexed question of the religious status of the Qadiani community was also brought before the National Assembly by Bhutto's law minister Hafiz Pirzada. On 10th September, the assembly officially declared the Ahmadis a minority, thereby barring individual members from attaining either the prime ministership or presidency of Pakistan under the constitution. The action was viewed as a fatal blow to the political aspirations of former Air Marshal Asghar Khan and as a major victory for Prime Minister Bhutto because many thitherto anti-Pakistan People's Party fundamentalists crossed over the assembly lobbies in Punjab and Islamabad to join what they now considered the more orthodox People's Party. Maulana Kausar Niazi, Bhutto's leading religious affairs advisor and Minister of Information in the Central Cabinet, was now in a position of ascending power. Maulana Viski, as he was called by some of his secular opponents in the cabinet, was so close to Bhutto personally that he later asserted that he had performed the orthodox Islamic ceremony that joined Zulfi and Husna in marriage, which Bhutto himself repeatedly denied. Husna Sheikh, on the other hand, absolutely considered herself his wife in the eyes of God and the witnesses. We were, as far as we were concerned, married. Although Islamic fundamentalists now had gained greater power inside both Bhutto's government and party, several of his closest early comrades in starting the People's Revolution dropped out. J. A. Rahim was replaced as Minister for Production and Commerce by Rah Raza in July. Finance Minister Mubashir Hassan was let go in October and Minister of Health Khurshid Hassan Mir was out of the cabinet before the year's end. If any trio represented the early revolutionary ideals of the Pakistan People's Party, it was Rahim, Hassan and Mir. Rahim was the theoretician who had masterminded the party's manifesto. Hassan, the socialist planner for nationalizing Pakistan's economy and redistributing its wealth, and Mir, the activist, advocate, and organizers of the mass meetings held in Pindi and Lahore. Mir still remained Deputy Secretary General of the party, but now saw his own influence over his Qaid-e-Awam slipping as Bhutto turned his face from the left to the right wings of his kitchen cabinet. The most brutal and tragic fall from Zulfi Bhutto's inner circle was that of Rahim. Until 3rd July 1974, he had been one of a handful of confidants, advisors, even friends, though some insisted that Zulfi had no friends, only followers, servants, and family. Yet, since 1966 at least, Rahim had been among his closest followers and had served Bhutto not only as a senior minister in his cabinet but as Secretary General of the party, which Bhutto continued to chair as Prime Minister. It was hardly surprising, therefore, that J. A. Rahim was one of a select group of cabinet ministers and important political advisers invited to a dinner at Prime Minister's house on 2nd July. The handsomely embossed invitation said 8 p.m. And though J. A. Rahim knew Zulfi well enough to understand that he rarely dined so early, he also knew that Zulfi liked his guests to be punctual. Rahim liked a drink or two before dinner, so he showed up on time, as did all the others. But Bhutto was nowhere to be seen at 8, nor did he appear even so much as to show himself from the room upstairs, where he remained closeted on some more important business at 9, 10, or 11 o'clock. All of the waiting coterie knew their leader and his habits well enough, of course, to appreciate the fact that he rarely slept at night and often sat down to start his dinner at midnight. There was plenty to drink and various tasty morsels to eat, so most of the guests sat patiently. What else should they do, after all? Most of them felt honored to have been chosen thus to serve. Rahim was getting tired by midnight. Perhaps he had too much to drink on an empty stomach and had twiddled his thumbs long enough. Shortly before 2nd July turned into 3rd July, he put down his empty tumbler and said in an irritated, clearly audible voice, "You bloody flunkies can wait as long as you like for the Maharaja of Larkana. I'm going home." His words elicited no response, only shock, anxious, knowing glances from one courtier to another. All of them could anticipate Bhutto's angry response to the patent insult from a Bengali who had been so well trained as a diplomat and till now had exhibited singularly sound political judgment. On reaching home, I went to bed, J. A. Rahim recalled. About 1 a.m., I was woken by my servant who said that there was a crowd of people before the house and someone at the door was demanding that it should be opened. I then armed myself with my revolver. Some men of the Federal security forces were climbing up the front balcony for the purpose of entering my bedroom. I went to the front door downstairs, said Ahmed Khan, chief of the Prime Minister's security, who was at the head of the mob of armed Federal Security Forces thugs, answered that he had come to deliver a message from the Prime Minister. I then ordered my bearer to open the front door. As the door opened, said Ahmed Khan, and several others rushed in armed with rifles or submachine guns. No letter was delivered, not even a verbal message. Besides being beaten by fists, I was hit by a rifle butts. I was thrown to the ground and hit while prostrate. My son, Sikandar, tried to intervene to protect me and was himself assaulted by Federal Security Forces men. I lost consciousness. S. A. Khan ordered his men to seize my son and then to lead us away. I was hardly able to stand, much less to walk, though I recovered consciousness. I was dragged out by my legs and thrown into a jeep. Bleeding profusely from a wound in the nose, the left nostril having been ripped open. No medical attention or first aid was offered. After nearly a couple of hours, Mr. Rafi Raza arrived at the police station. He drove us in his car to my house shortly after 3 a.m. On the 20th July, I was flown to Karachi where no one was allowed by the police to see me at home until I left for Europe. What I cannot get over is Rahim's diatribe and invective against Larkana. Zulfi later wrote from his own prison cell, reflecting on his life as he awaited death. What harm did poor Larkana or the poorer people of Larkana do to Rahim? He was royally entertained at Larkana for days on end. If I was Rahim, I would never forget the hospitality of Larkana. But Zulfi Bhutto was no Rahim, of course, though he may have thought at times and in certain perverse ways that he was. Rahim's private life had not been very complimentary. He wrote in that dark and stinking death cell. It is a story of mistresses and misbehavior. Why then did I get friendly with him and make him the Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party and senior minister and all the rest? A very good question, he mused. Many good questions kept invading his mind now, as they must so often have done, through those long sleepless nights and sunless days while he awaited final judgment. How many times did he think of his impulsively foolish explosion from the floor of the National Assembly exactly 1 month before Rahim was so savagely beaten? That 3rd June 1974, he was, of course, intolerably provoked by the treacherous Ahmad Raza Kasuri, who kept needling him, criticizing him for the pettiest, stupidest things, just to try and show how big he was, when everyone knew Kasuri was a nobody. Nobody, at least, compared to Zulfi Bhutto, convener of the Islamic Summit, friend of Gaddafi, Nixon and Mao, who almost alone had toppled the field marshal and by now had outlived him. "You keep quiet," Prime Minister Bhutto impulsively shouted to the rude, noisy nobody, Kasuri. "I have had enough of you. Absolute poison. I will not tolerate your nuisance." By then, he thought he had learned to control such outbursts, but still they came like lightning. Cloudbursts over a torrentially swollen river. He never knew when such an episode might happen again or after it was over. He sometimes barely understood why he had said what he said, what had incited him to intemperate speech. Yet there it was, before the entire assembly, no more than the truth, of course, but so imprudently spoken. Strange how unpredictable he was, recalled his old hunting friend, former Air Marshal Zulfikar Ali Khan, Pakistan's ambassador to the United States during Benazir Bhutto's premiership. He could be charming to one person and for no reason just turn on another person who was close to him. It was very strange how he did that. No rational explanation. I never understood that. Hanif Rame suggested that the strange split or division in Zulfi Bhutto's personality was perhaps attributable to the enormous cultural differences that divided his mother from his father. He was two different people, really, you see. Rafi Raza and Admiral S.M. Ahsan also remarked on that split personality, which partitioned Zulfi into a rational, intelligent, responsible Bhutto on one side and an irrational, impulsive, uncontrollable Bhutto on the other. Whether he was, in fact, 1 or 21, Zulfi Bhutto's may never now be known. But he was a complex personality. In August of 1974, Prime Minister Bhutto appeared before a joint session of Parliament to urge extension of the state of emergency under which his government ruled and for which he required parliamentary approval every 6 months. Opposition leader Wali Khan insisted, however, that the constant state of crisis and emergency in which Pakistan found itself was Bhutto's own fault, his creation to keep everyone in perpetual fear and terror, for then he could announce what must be done to save the nation. When Bhutto rose to address the legislators, Wali Khan, his National Awami Party followers and other members of the opposition, including Ahmad Raza Kasuri, walked out with fists raised in defiance. Bhutto's response was a long and scathing critique in which he forcefully argued that every crisis along the frontier from Balochistan to Peshawar was directly attributable to Wali Khan himself, whose close ties to Kabul and Delhi were also noted. Well, Mr. Wali Khan thinks that we are so naive and we are so innocent that we are not aware of his activities. Does he not know that we have smashed in Peshawar the plot of those people who were throwing bombs and hand grenades and things like that? Wali Khan gave credit to Yahya Khan for holding the first general elections in the history of Pakistan. We know what is the implication of that statement. We understand that fully well. Bhutto said, sensitive to the opposition's repeated demands that he call fresh elections, yet determined not to be pushed prematurely into what he knew might prove to be a trap, for having ousted or alienated Mumtaz, Talpur, Khar, Rahim, and several Kasuris. He had lost support from both wings of his party. But Wali Khan's praise for Yahya Khan as a relative paragon of democratic freedoms compared to Zulfi really angered Zulfi. I will not give him that credit, but if ever Yahya Khan in his whole tumultuous life did some right thing by mistake, that was the time when he banned the National Awami Party. Zulfi alluded to Wali Khan as an agent of Afghanistan and India, but stopped short of accusing that he would do next year. Sardar Dawood moved closer to both the Soviet Union and India for support of his revolutionary regime in Kabul, and also appealed more openly to Wali Khan for the tribal Pakhtun support that Khan controlled along the rugged frontier with Pakistan, where Wali Khan and his venerable father were indeed the kings of the Khyber and Jalalabad. Wali Khan visited Afghanistan that summer en route to London and when returning from medical treatment there. Each time he met with Dawood in Kabul and was hailed wherever he went in Afghanistan with shouts of Pakhtunistan Zindabad. His personal power and unique popularity all along the frontier was secret to no one who knew the Pathans and their lifelong devotions to old Badshah Abdul Ghaffar Khan and his regal son Wali Khan. Zulfi was well aware of his leading rival's popularity. Pakistan has a comprehensive and vigorous nuclear program. Bhutto admitted to the NBC's Jack Reynolds in Pindi that September. But it will be directed for peaceful uses, and when I say peaceful uses, I mean it. Bhutto also insisted that in Balochistan, he was fighting against feudalism and tribalism. That Balochistan is the last bastion of the worst form of feudalism and tribalism in these parts. In the aftermath, moreover, of the 1971 dismemberment of Pakistan, as he called it, those tribal chiefs he had imprisoned launched a mini rebellion against the federal government. He now estimated that there were at the most only 400 tribal rebels involved. Theirs is a struggle for their chiefs who are behind the bars. He vowed that he was always ready to negotiate a political settlement, but insisted on the presidential need to modernize the region. First, building more roads, more hospitals, more schools, and finally, the writ of the federal government must be respected there. When asked why he kept so many of the Balochi leaders in prison or under house arrest, if he truly believed in democracy and political settlements, Zulfi replied, "Anyone who tries to preach secession or says that he will break down the edifice of the state or says that he is going to see to it that there is bloodshed. These are the people who bring in little toys, little bombs from Afghanistan. They plant them here and they throw the hand grenades there. What do you expect me to do? Invite them to a tea party?" 3 weeks later, Bhutto gratefully informed the nation that the insurgency against the state in Balochistan had come to an end. About 5,000 Mari tribal had presented themselves with their arms to the authorities, he declared, and he had decided to grant them a full amnesty. So, the insurgency was over, but the fighting continued. Bhutto flew to Moscow on 22nd October for a state visit that lasted 3 days. At the farewell banquet, he toasted the health and happiness of Leonid Brezhnev, Nikolai Podgorny, and Kosygin. He was happy to recall his first visit to Moscow 13 years earlier, when we made the first substantial move towards constructive cooperation between our two countries for oil exploration. The joint communique that concluded the visit noted that a new trade agreement would be negotiated between the USSR and Pakistan, both of whom desired to develop mutually beneficial trade and economic cooperation. But Moscow was much colder to Zulfi on this visit than it had been 13 years before. For the USSR's Treaty of Peace and Friendship with India was still in its early years of bright promise, and Soviet ties with President Daoud seemed much more friendly than they would all too soon prove to be. So Zulfi flew home swiftly to welcome his good friend Henry Kissinger back to Pakistan. Bhutto cast aside his written text to say a few words from my heart, not just to Kissinger but to his lovely new bride, whom Zulfi toasted first. I remember fondly waltzing with Matilda, but we prefer tilting Kissinger. He improvised. But they say that Dr. Kissinger doesn't tilt anymore. But why did he get married? In a slightly more sober tone, he lifted his glass again, focusing on Kissinger. "We who are your admirers would like you to be considered as a modern Metternich." But the difference is that Metternich's nation had lost the war and Metternich came after a Napoleon. He asked Kissinger, who was headed for Kabul and Tehran, to say hello to Daoud for me and tell him that we would like to be friends with them. And when you go after that to Iran, Please give our warmest regards and affection and respect to His Majesty, the Shahenshah of Iran. Neither Kissinger nor the Shah ever forgot that Zulfi had told Nixon the Shah was unstable. Zulfi turned to smile again at Mrs. Kissinger, to whom he raised his glass a bit higher. Kissinger had brought a cordial invitation from newly inaugurated President Gerald Ford for another state visit to Washington early the next year. Zulfi was delighted to accept. November of 1974 would not be as pleasant a month as October had been for Prime Minister Bhutto, who always enjoyed foreign trips and jet-set visitors, brilliant banquets and tall beauties. The month started with another noxious, insulting speech in the National Assembly by Wali Khan, who repeated his stale-old phrase, "Bhutto and Pakistan cannot coexist." As if he were the patriot, Ahmad Khan Kusuri applauded loudest, of course, pure poison, that one. Another intelligence report that had just reached Bhutto of Kasuri having said on 27th October that the Prime Minister had broken Pakistan into pieces to install himself into power and that he was a traitor and a son of a traitor. And the shooting continued in Balochistan, as if those Murrays and Mengals had not heard him say the insurgency was over. His chief minister of Balochistan explained to the press that incidents of bomb blasts and other subversive activities in the region were all carried out with the connivance of insurgents from across the Durand Line border. The explanation did nothing to make the news any less disturbing, less embarrassing. So 2 days later, on 9th November, at a public meeting in Sadiqabad, Zulfi gave notice to Afghanistan that it was inviting trouble if it continued to interfere in Pakistan's frontier affairs. The next day, at another public meeting, he tried to explain why the economy was so bad and there was so little wheat. Oil prices had skyrocketed, which was good after all for brother Islamic nations. The reason he had not opposed the OPEC price hike. November of 1974 would not be as pleasant a month as October had been for Prime Minister Bhutto, who always enjoyed foreign trips and jet-set visitors, brilliant banquets and tall beauties. The month started with another noxious, insulting speech in the National Assembly by Wali Khan, who repeated his stale-old phrase, "Bhutto and Pakistan cannot coexist." As if he were the patriot, Ahmad Khan Kusuri applauded loudest, of course, pure poison, that one. Another intelligence report that had just reached Bhutto of Kasuri having said on 27th October that the Prime Minister had broken Pakistan into pieces to install himself into power and that he was a traitor and a son of a traitor. And the shooting continued in Balochistan, as if those Murrays and Mengals had not heard him say the insurgency was over. His chief minister of Balochistan explained to the press that incidents of bomb blasts and other subversive activities in the region were all carried out with the connivance of insurgents from across the Durand Line border. The explanation did nothing to make the news any less disturbing, less embarrassing. So 2 days later, on 9th November, at a public meeting in Sadiqabad, Zulfi gave notice to Afghanistan that it was inviting trouble if it continued to interfere in Pakistan's frontier affairs. The next day, at another public meeting, he tried to explain why the economy was so bad and there was so little wheat. Oil prices had skyrocketed, which was good after all for brother Islamic nations. The reason he had not opposed the OPEC price hike.